And I want to take this opportunity to welcome everyone to this webinar where we're discussing the media threats affecting South Africa. And this is the third leg of webinars that we've been having. We started with Botswana some 2 weeks ago. Then we had Mozambique last week, which was very interesting. And this week we are discussing the situation in sorry. This week we're discussing the situation in South Africa, and this followed a research which was done by Magnificent and Naledi who have joined us for this meeting, and I'm going to give them an opportunity to speak about their research, how they did it, and what they found out. And we've got very interesting panelists who are going to help us unpack not only this report, but also the media situation in South Africa, because we're also aware that certain things may have moved since the report was written. But I want to, before I introduce the panelists and the authors of this report, I just want to also welcome Interwatch staff that are here. We have Sisipo, who is the office manager at Interwatch. We also have Yasin, who's a program manager, and we have Herbert. Herbert is a journalism and research director. So basically, he's the one who commissioned this work, and what we are discussing today is basically his product, working together with researchers and journalists across the region. Our executive director, PS, is also here. PS Pigo is a well-known figure in the region. I'll just ask him to say a few words to introduce Interwatch and what Interwatch does, and also maybe say one or two things about the work that Interwatch is doing with journalists and the media. PS, may you please just say one or two words?
Thank you very much, Owen, and greetings to colleagues in the virtual room here. I've recently taken over as the director at Interwatch, and I'm still in many respects finding my feet. What we're participating today is part of a kind of a flagship project for Interwatch. It's part of an EU-funded program looking at the situation of journalism, protection of journalism, harassment of journalism, and the state of the media, with a focus on Southern Africa. As Owen has said, this is one of 7 reports that have been recently released, and I think a key part of our challenge now is to try and get conversations going around these issues, get this report and its derivative products in front of the right people to have that conversation. We're going to be looking at, from these reports, a number of cross-cutting themes that come out. And we're going to try and expand this conversation into other parts of the region as well. We understand, obviously, the media is in the crosshairs of shifting global geopolitics and the challenges around fragmentation, funding, and all sorts of issues that are complicating our information space at the moment. So I'm looking forward to this conversation, and I'm very much hoping that this will also help guide where Interwatch is best needed. We're not an NGO that is intending to plant our flag in the sand. It's not all about our branding, about what we want. We intend to be a resource for the media in this region and beyond, and very much hope that you will guide us in that journey. So looking forward to the conversation today and for that to continue thereafter. Thank you very much, Owen.
Thank you very much, Piers. I want to introduce Magnificent and Naledi, the authors of this report. Maybe if you can kindly introduce yourself. We'll start with Naledi. Just say who you are and the work you do, and then we move on to Magnificent. Just introduce yourself. Thank you.
Hello, everyone. I am Naledi Sikhakhane. I'm a journalist who does a lot of social justice work. I was recently with the Daily Maverick and previously with the New Frame, and have freelanced before. I've also done a bit of work with Interwatch doing research around digital and media rights, especially as pertaining to human rights defenders and journalists.
And hi, everyone. I'm Magnificent Mndebele. I go by Max in the streets, but I work as a media production lecturer at CPUT. And in the past, I've been a journalist and investigator. I am an editor. So, yeah, I think that's, and now I'm a media researcher. Not just on these reports that I do, but merely by being an academic institution. Yeah, that's just me in a nutshell.
Thank you so much, Magnificent, and thank you, Naledi. We have very good panelists today who will help us unpack this report and also the media situation in South Africa. Let me start with Phathiswa Magopeni. Can you kindly introduce yourself? I know you are a lady with so many hats. Kindly introduce yourself. Hello. Okay, maybe she's not joined yet, but we also have Caroline James. She's the advocacy officer at Amabhungane. Caroline, may you kindly introduce yourself?
Thanks very much, Owen. Yes, as Owen said, I'm Caroline James and I'm the Advocacy Coordinator at Amabhungane Centre for Investigative Journalism. As the Advocacy Coordinator, my role is really to assist the journalists operating in the sort of media freedom space, but to try and ensure that media freedom remains open and accessible for our journalists, but also journalists more generally in the country. And so we've engaged with some of the threats that are mentioned in the report. We've spoken about some of them that we've encountered ourselves, but also that some of our other colleagues in the media have, and just what we've seen monitoring law reform and different pieces of legislation that are moving through Parliament, just getting a sense of where the country is from a media freedom and access position.
Thank you so much, Caroline. It's a pleasure to have you on this panel, and we're aware of the kind of work that you've done around advocacy and around the media laws and dragging the government to court in some instances, and we hope you'll be able to share with us some of that work. We also have an academic, Dr. Meli Ncube, from Stellenbosch University. Dr. Ncube, may you kindly introduce yourself?
Thank you, Owen. I always struggle to introduce myself because I never know what to say and not what to say. But in short, my name is Meli. I am currently responsible for trying to shape the next future generation of journalists. So I don't know if I'm doing a good job or not as of yet, because there's so much AI happening right now. But the pool is a mess, so to speak. But yeah, that's just me in a nutshell. I enjoy doing a lot of research. My research interests are on information integrity and disinformation and media trust in Africa and in Africa and the general global south.
I think you're muted, Owen, in case you're...
Thank you so much, Doc, and welcome. When Phathiswa joins, we'll ask her to briefly introduce herself, but she wears so many hats. She's involved with women in media in Africa. She's also with the South African Press Council. She has been a director. She has been an editor, and we believe she will bring in a lot of wealth to this discussion. Now, let us go into our report. Max and Naledi, may you kindly share the main findings of your report. What did you find?
Okay. I don't know if Naledi, you want to go first, or should I just dive into it?
No, you can go ahead.
Okay. So thanks for that. I mean, the report looked at a number of key thematic areas. We've tried to look at the legal threats. We've also tried to look at political threats. I think this is where SLAP suits also come into, which we then would unpack. We then also looked at just the economic and ownership, because even just the sustainability of the media itself and the way we are, it's also brings a crisis. And then we then went on to look at extra legal threats that would then come outside of the other areas that I've mentioned here. But specifically, I'm not going to touch on every laws that we've that bring threats to the media for this purpose, but there's some that I wanted to highlight. If you look at South Africa and you just compare it with the rest of the African continent, it is safe to say that we are safe despite all the threats we want to talk about to a great degree, and especially with the laws that I'm going to talk about. From what we've observed is that even if there are laws that are enacted or put in place, usually the goal is not just to get to journalists. It's often for a good cause. You think about the Cyber Crimes Act, for example. I mean, it's really for a good cause. Crime committed or through the commissioning of a computer and all of that. But then you find that there are also then, while you are looking at cybercrime, there are also then other problematic clauses where you then find that specifically Section 3.1, it says that anyone that is found to be in possession of data, and then police, for example, question you then to ask you where, then how did you find that data? How did it come to be in your possession? Let's say, for argument's sake, then you are unwilling then to answer directly, because perhaps the manner in which you'd explain might then compromise your source. That can then lead you into either being in prison for up to 5 years or being fined. So it's just one of those just problematic clauses, but the law itself, if you read it carefully, it wasn't necessarily designed to bring threats to the journalist. And in fact, some organizations like SANEF as well, and a couple of others have also tried to challenge that. If we look into responses, then you have the POPI Act. I believe Caroline will probably also talk more about that, even the PIA request. So if you look at the reasons why those laws were put in place, it was for a legitimate reason to genuinely protect people, because, for example, there are entities that get to be in possession of really sensitive data about people. And then those institutions then have higher obligations than to actually protect the people whom they, whose information they process. But then that also now extends to government departments and government agencies and the like. Then what we found, then you would notice then that politicians, because in fact, government departments, while they may have actual people that are appointed, whether that's say your HOD, appointed on a permanent basis, or other stuff, but also oftentimes you find that some of those decisions were made by political heads, meaning politicians. Then when the media then makes an inquiry on that, then those very same government departments then will then abuse this very same POPI Act and the prior request, and then they would tell you that we can't disclose A and B and C. Say, for example, there's a tender or dirty tender or dealings, and then you make a request on that you want to understand how the processes were done. They will then use this very same POPI or POIA as a basis of why they are refusing to be transparent in that regard. So those were some of the other issues, and especially when we talk about POIA request, a lot of the investigative journalism work as well. This is in my experience as well when I was at Amabhungane, and also having worked side by side with Caroline James, for example, to help us to be able to then conduct those investigations. Then you find because this POIA request takes so much time, and then, for example, you can go up to I think it's about 60 days or so, or 30 days. But Caroline, I'm subject to corrections here on the specific number of days. But then when you look back just to work on one story, then it will take you about 3 to 5 months, just simply because someone in a government department would just be quiet, not respond, and then respond in the last minute when that expiry timeline comes in, and then they just say, look, we've just declined that request. I mean, that's, in a sense, then it's an abuse of this very same law that was, enacted for a good reason. In the report, we then also do mention, for example, the case between Amabhungane and PetroSA being stonewalled. I hope, Caroline, you can unpack on that. So that's just at the basis of legal threats, just the 3 ones that I wanted to highlight. The one that is most popular is the RICA. SEMSOL, Amabhungane were also able then to challenge that act because he was spied, and then, of course, then there was a ruling made. The invalidity ruling was like for 3 years. It expired sometime late last year. And President Ramaphosa did not then assent that or for the recommendations that were in place, because what you'd find previously was that police could decide just to spy on an investigative journalist without even disclosing that the person we intend to spy is either a lawyer or a journalist, who often do work in the public interest. So now those changes then require that there must be that public interest defense. So the last time I checked, Cyril Ramaphosa turned back the law back to Parliament. So that would sort of now mean we are operating in sort of it's an ambiguous space, because the Constitutional Court gave 3 years for Parliament to make the changes and effect the necessary changes, but it's been sent back, and then the 3 years has lapsed, and still those changes have not been fully effected. Then when we talk now about political threats, what we found, this is also now where SLAPP suits come in. We deal a lot with the SLAPP suits, because in South Africa, SLAPP suit, as we know it today, was properly acknowledged in 2021 during the Toloben case, where activists were challenging mining companies in the Eastern Cape. But then the company to challenge that, in fact, I wrote down the figure so that I don't just mess up figures. But they then made claims that the environmental lawyers had defamed the companies, these mining companies, that either these 3 lawyers will have to pay 14.25 million or apologize. Then, of course, because then these parties come or act as if they genuinely have a legitimate cause of why they are approaching the court, because you've defamed all of them, basically just using that aspect. So those are some of the things. So 2021 was just the starting point. 2023, I think this is where in our findings, things get a little bit more interesting. From the prominent case studies that we've highlighted, Amabhungane comes back again. This is 1 June 2023. It's in Amabhungane and the Moti group. They ran stories under the Moti files. But then Moti is a rich businessman, but also a lot of dodgy dealings. And then they go to court then to get Amabhungane from releasing the series. So that's now the start of 2023. Then you go again in August, another prominent case, 2 friends of Deputy President Paul Mashatile. It's Bridgman Stoll and Mike Meli. They also now seek a gag order against Media 24 because News 24 to be specific, because they were called Alex Mafias, a term that had already been used for the past 2 decades. So really there is no legitimate cause why them suddenly, except just, abusing the law. Then you have again one of the most popular one, the one between Karen Morgan, court reporter and legal reporter for News 24 with Jacob Zuma. It really dragged a lot and took out so much from it. So then you have these either rich individuals or companies that would then use the law. Basically, it's just lawful. Use the law to threaten journalists, and not many media outlets would be like either Amabhungane with the financial muscles to say and then take on the bad actors, or like a Daily Maverick or News 24. There are also the other smaller media institutions, and you can then imagine then when that happens, journalists then are obviously threatened, because if you have now a bad actor, overnight you're just told now that you can't publish a story. It really becomes hard to be vindicated, to get your right vindicated in that aspect, because it requires the media institution to pay handsomely just to have their rights vindicated. So it's quite an expensive exercise just to get your rights vindicated. And then the bad actors know that. You will send the one classic case that I wanted to highlight was, for example, the one about Bongan Hans, for example. He sends questions just like a routine, what would be a routine, inquiry. You have allegations, you just reach out now, you want to give people comment. And then the next day, you're told that you can't even do the very same story where you sent an inquiry or on the affected parties, because you're giving them a right of reply. They choose not to reply, but to go to court to gag you. So that really is a chilling effect then to media institutions. So those are some of the findings and what we talk to in the report. And then when we move to economic threats, I think those are well known now in the South African context, and I don't think South Africa necessarily is exceptional in how just the economic and ownership threats. I can't almost recall, or there would be very few newsrooms in South Africa that would say they have not had to retrench staff since those institutions had started. So then that's a survival matter. That's really a real threat. Daily Maverick has had to let go of people. Mail and Guidance has had to let go of people. Media 24, some of the titles had to shut down, and then some people lost jobs. New Frame, and Naledi mentioned New Frame, who worked together at the time at New Frame, who also had to be retrenched. There's just so many cases in independent media. So I think that business aspect is one of the biggest threats as well, outside of the one that I've just mentioned. So those are some of the findings from the report, Owen. And when we talk about now the extra judicial or societal threats, these are then abuses that journalists suffer not as a result of, say, a company or the use of the laws. It's just pure bullies on the internet. Journalists have had to then pay significant prices for that. There's a lot of them that have had to be subjected, but also there's also a clear pattern that female journalists especially are the ones that are often then subjected the most to this. And some of the ones in the report, some of the words I can't, because it's basically pure vulgar and slurs against female journalists. And then you can see now that's the gendered harassment. I can recall again some cases where, and in fact, just to give context, the two political parties, when we kept searching, that kept coming more and more, was the EFF, Economic Freedom Fighters, and the ANC. Those are the two parties in the main that, at least from our report, took the cup when it comes to abusing female journalists in particular, either through the periods of Jacob Zuma, still in the ANC at the time, and or Julius Malema, and all of that. So those are some of the threats that we map out in the report. Sometimes it even comes as like Justin, really very honest, like the one in the report, the one aspect that we've attached, for example, Paul van Wyk of Daily Maverick posted an editorial published by Meli and Gaiden. She was merely sharing on X, or what was Twitter. And then you have Julius Malema commenting and saying, quote unquote, "You are sick, go to hell, Satan." That's just pure abuse. And in fact, that piece, it mentioned that Julius Malema is to take responsibility for violence meted out to journalists. He's stoking the flames of a campaign against journalists whose work he disputes, etc. And then instead of them engaging on the merit of the content, it defaults to slurs and all of that. I think that would be just some of the threats that come out in a nutshell. Naledi, then you can also pick up and add.
Thank you so much, Max. Naledi, briefly, can you just add if there's anything that is left? But Max was very comprehensive in summarizing the contents of the report. Over to you, Naledi.
No, thank you so much. I think Magnificent definitely covered what some of the findings that I think are most important, and give like a snapshot of what we found to be happening in the South African media space currently. So I think it would be good for me to just go through some of the recommendations and what we thought would be great.
Sorry, Naledi. We'll deal with the recommendations later. Yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
so there's
towards the end. So we can go into the panel discussion. Then I'll ask you to look at the recommendations later on.
No problem.
Okay, thank you. And thank you. Phathiswa has joined us. Phathiswa, everyone else introduce themselves. Would you like to introduce yourself? I had mentioned that you are a person who's wearing many hats, and I can't mention all of them, but may you kindly introduce yourself before we go into the panel discussion?
Yes. Okay, there I am. I was trying to look for the button for the camera. Okay, my name is Phathiswa Magopeni. I'm a journalist, so mine is simple. I'm just a journalist, a lowly journalist, and that's all I do. But being with the Press Council, it's more about some of the stuff that's coming up here. And as we get into the discussion, I will talk about it. But as the Press Council, what we look for is to balance the need for the media to operate freely in a space where the respect is there for media freedom, but also balancing that with the interests and the rights of the public in terms of media accountability. So our job sits at that sensitive space where we have to balance the two, media being able to do its work without interference, but the public's right being respected. So that's what I do. But as far as the women in media is concerned, the issues that have been raised here about women being the most exposed in terms of cyberbullying and bullying in general as journalists, it's part of the work that we do, but we look broader than that. But as we get into the discussion, I will speak more on it. Yeah.
Thank you so much, Phathiswa. It's a pleasure for us to have you here. Right, Caroline, maybe we'll start with you. Want to look at the legal threats. It seems like there are so many legal threats happening in South Africa. Some of them are linked with the politicians, the SLAPs, and we know you've done a lot of work taking government to court, challenging some of those laws. And there's also the RICA, which Amabhungane successfully challenged, and is still that matter is still not resolved, and journalists are basically operating in a gray area as far as surveillance is concerned. May you kindly share with us what's going on with RICA and also the legal situation, the SLAPs and so forth? Carol?
Thank you, Owen. Okay, well, I'll start with the RICA because while it's a disappointing answer, it's quite quick. Unfortunately, very little is happening with the RICA case. As Mags mentioned, this was a result of Amabhungane and our managing director, Sam Sol, challenging the constitutionality of it and the court declaring the law unconstitutional. A draft amendment bill was put together by Parliament, and we participated in making suggestions on how to strengthen that bill. And the key elements that we were highlighting throughout that process was that the amendment bill didn't respond to the weaknesses that the Constitutional Court had identified. This shouldn't have been a very complicated amendment bill because the Constitutional Court had a judgment which set out all the areas in which the existing law was unconstitutional, and the amendment bill just didn't really respond to that. We were grateful that the President accepted our sort of feelings on that, and he also believed that the bill wasn't satisfactory, and so he refused to sign it and sent it back. But that's sort of where we are left, and we are sort of in as much dark as everyone else is on where this process is and what's going to be happening next. But it is, in some ways, it's heartening that the President does actually take seriously his responsibility to do the final signing off on pieces of legislation. But it is frustrating that it's such a long process to do this. And then in respect to the other legal threats, I think it's really useful to distinguish between the sort of the physical and direct threats, as Mags has spoken about, but how important those are, absolutely. But the legal threats that journalists and media houses are facing are as damaging to the media environment, but also damaging to individual journalists' ability to continue to work and the ability to remain in a profession that is a very stressful and difficult profession, particularly now. But I think what we have been seeing with the legal threats, particularly sort of what often is referred to as lawfare, and it's people who are subject to critical reporting using the courts to fight their battles. And as Mags mentioned, there has been a rise in SLAP suits, and SLAPs stand for Strategic Litigation Against Public Participation. It's a concept that has sort of really began being understood in the US and then spread through sort of Europe. And it is, as Mags mentioned, quite a recent development in South African law. But what I found really interesting in looking at the way South African courts have addressed slap suits is that the understanding around the world is that it's when defamation cases are brought against a journalist or an activist. And that's how the Constitutional Court first incorporated the concept of slaps into South African law. But the unique situation of threats to journalists in South Africa has meant that our courts have had to adapt it a little bit more. And so they're using the principles of acting against slap suits in cases where people who are being written about are bringing attempts to have an urgent interdict ordered against journalists to stop them reporting their damaging piece of reporting. Also, as Mags mentioned, the criminal case against Karen Morm, that was also described as a slap. And I think the definition in our case that Judge Roland Sutherland set out in the judgment that he did for us was really, really beneficial. And I think it's important to sort of mention how he defined slap suits. Let me just get to it. So in this case, which as Mags mentioned was the Moti Group, a very powerful businessman with lots of money, who took us to court to try and prevent us from publishing stories that were critical of him. And Judge Sutherland from the Joburg High Court defined a slap suit as any legal proceedings by a well-resourced entity aimed at harassing a vulnerable person or entity by outspending them in litigation and thereby forcing a capitulation. And I think what that really does highlight as well is that it's generally people with lots of money, lots of ability to access legal systems, but that it's the whole goal is to just intimidate and stymie and prevent reporting. They're not really interested in the facts of the legal case. And in many of these cases, they don't win. And we've seen our judges regularly sort of, excusing the pun, slapping these types of cases down. But the danger is that they still happen. And we've seen it just last week that News 24 was taken to court again with another attempt for a prior restraint, an attempt to prevent them from reporting on allegations of corruption and links to the murder of a whistleblower. Again, the court was really strong in striking it down and declaring that the conduct of the company that was seeking to bring this interdict was wrong and that they couldn't do it. But it causes a lot of both financial hardship to the media entity. It delays the reporting of the information, and it also impacts on the individual journalists. They are worried about physical safety as a result of this, but also it just takes time up in their general work. It's draining resource and mentally. And I think that it's important to recognize that while the threats are happening all the time, the judgments are really good, but it's got a long, deep effects that are still being felt. Owen, I'm not sure if that answers your question, or you'd like me to go into any more detail on any particular aspect.
No, thank you. It does. But maybe I've got a follow-up question which I wanted to ask, and this refers to Rika, which is still hanging and no one knows what's really happening. What are the dangers? Journalists are operating in the dark, and also we know that it was declared unconstitutional after Amabhungane challenged the law when SEMSO was spied on illegally, and I assume the spying is still going on. And recently we had Lieutenant General Mkwananzi saying he believes journalists should be spied on and so forth. So it means that there are some people in the security sector who believe that journalists should be spied on. And in the absence of a clear law, clear legislation around what can be done and what can be done, what are the dangers, the present dangers that South African journalists and media institutions are facing? And perhaps also Dr. Ncube can come in there from an academic point of view after you speak.
Yeah, I mean, I think, as you say, that is the problem. There is now this legal lacuna that the Constitutional Court highlighted and declared unconstitutional and warned against. And as you said, it's still existing. And it's really difficult for journalists to operate in this environment, knowing that, as you say, there's the likelihood or possibility, I'm not sure whether it rises quite the likelihood for everybody, but there's a possibility of them being surveilled. And that really compromises the work that they do, their professional obligations to protect the identity of sources if that's necessary, and just general concerns around surveillance. And I think even in the years since the Rika case was first brought by Amabhungane, we've seen around the world just an increase in this sort of surveillance state acceptance, and that there does seem to be less pushback against this type of activity from those in power and those in charge around the world. And it definitely is really difficult. And I can't offer any solutions to that at the moment. We just have to trust in this long legislative process. But perhaps there are more ideas from the academic side. So I will hand over now.
Thank you so much. Dr. Ncube, as an academic, what are the dangers when journalists and media institutions are operating in the dark, and yet we have a case study of journalists being spied on and so forth? What does this do?
So, as a researcher, I think one of the biggest dangers now is that the integrity of information is crumbling. There's a loss of media trust. And it's very imperative now that every journalist should now know their legal rights and should know something about legal literacy. So
Hello, have we lost the doctor?
It appears that way.
Yeah, okay. Maybe we can move on Phathiswa. It seems there's an appetite for the rich and the famous to lean towards the court, not just to seek justice, but actually to hinder journalists from doing their work. But with I think you are also the one to see that there's freedom, the freedom of the media. What are you doing to bridge that gap so that maybe people can trust you instead of seeking to go into the court? And also, we are also realizing that in South Africa, there's been some concern around ethics and so forth, as highlighted by Mkwananzi when he was justifying maybe the need to spy on journalists. What's your view, and what are you doing as an organization with other organizations like SANEF to address this situation?
I think maybe let me start with the first part on what the Press Council actually does, because it is an efficient mechanism to adjudicate public complaints against media houses, but it's got to be media houses that are members of the Press Council. So this one means that members of the public don't have to pay to get justice against the media, and also that you don't have to have a lawyer to get to the Press Council, because there is a structure with the ombudsman, with the public advocate, the case manager, and the appeals chair, who actually process the complaints depending on the level, whether it's mediation or adjudication when things don't get resolved at mediation. So that takes away the pressure from the public to think about having to pay to actually get justice. But also the fact that we are a self-regulatory mechanism adds weight to the fact that the public can actually trust what we do, because being self-regulatory also means that half of the panel of the Press Council when we adjudicate matters are members of the public who sit on the panels, and then the half are media representatives. So you have a balance there which gives legitimacy to the processes of the Press Council rather than going to court, because it's a swift mechanism. You get an outcome quicker than you would have gone to court, and it costs less. But again, you can tell even from the complaints that come through that the intention that takes people to court is exactly the same that leads them to the Press Council, but it's just that it's a swift mechanism. So the attempts to block journalists from doing their work is also embedded in the complaints that come through to the Press Council. So we are always mindful of that. But in the way we adjudicate, we have to be fair in how we approach the issues to the extent that the public or the complainants still get treated fairly in the way their issues are dealt with, in the same way that we have to protect media freedom. But we have had discussions as part of SANEF and the attempts to set up a legal defense fund for journalists, and that has been in the process. It hasn't gone too far, but it's something that is uppermost in our minds. But there is also another entity that is working around defending journalists that find themselves in precarious situation and do not have money. The Free Expression Legal Network, which works with all other bodies that play in the media space. So there are different things that are being done to ensure that journalists don't find themselves exposed when those who are moneyed decide to take them to court. The part that you're talking about that Mkhwanazi made reference to the need to monitor the work of journalists, there is something that we overlook, and I have spoken a bit about it on different occasions, that we pay less attention to the contracts that we sign when we get employed as journalists. And I'm saying this from experience. There is something that looks like it is not as dangerous, but the consequences could be dire if you find yourself in that position. Your contracts talk about in fact, you give consent to the company to intercept your communication on all the devices that you get given by the company. So if you are using a mobile phone that's issued by the company, you know that you've consented to being monitored. Laptop that's issued by the company, or desktop device that's issued by the company. If your contract has that aspect of consent, you must know that that company has a right to intercept your communication. But three things come up as a risk. It's risk to you as a journalist that someone else that you don't know, sitting in an IT division of the entity, is monitoring your communication. You don't know where that information ends up. Secondly, it's the sources of your stories that end up being exposed to these people who are sitting as IT experts or wherever they are within the company, and the access to that information that you want to know where it's going to end up and whether you are safe or not when that has been issued, including your sources. And also to do with whistleblowers that get to engage with journalists, and the information they share ends up with the people who are supposedly intercepting communication in the name of protecting company technological communications, because that's how it's framed. I've had to deal with this, and I challenged it where I came across it. And it wasn't a good fight, but it's a fight that needed to be fought. But I've always said to journalists, look at your contract and see what you've consented to. At the time you're getting employed, you don't think about it. In fact, you don't even consider that that thing is there. You just sign a contract without paying attention to what is detailed there. And yet this is how you get monitored by the different companies that we work for as journalists. So it is a big issue. It's not just what we think would be done by authorities or mean characters or actors that are out there. There's something else that's happening within the companies that we work for. It's something that we need to attend to. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Phathiswa, for highlighting that. I mean, I think it's something that journalists don't really pay attention to. When you get a job, you're probably excited, and you're in a hurry to sign, and you don't look at that. And yet, the protection of our sources, and it's critical, of course, if they are compromised. But as I know you're also a member of SANEF, what are you doing to maybe educate journalists? Have there been formal channels through which journalists are educated around these issues, including the spying that seems to be a problem? Because the same Saw case would then be an indicator of that spying is occurring, and other journalists might have been spied on, but they may not know. Yeah, what has been done around? Yeah.
As the levels of public trust decline on the media, these are conversations that we're having, because as you are dealing with one threat, new threats emerge, and your engagements, whether it's workshops or training programs, tend to deal with what is emerging, and therefore these are things that you are looking at as well. But there's something peculiar about the media sector and journalism in particular. I've never seen, let's look at the medical field, and you can look at nurses, you can look at doctors. I've never seen nurses having to take responsibility for the survival and protection of the sector. It's only our sector that has to do that you are going to have editors as employees trying to protect themselves and others within the system. So this is what is happening. So when people say, what is SANEF doing? What is the Press Council doing? What is so-and-so doing? Which are actually bodies that coordinate different aspects of the media system. Bear in mind that particularly with editors' forums or editors' councils, even across the continent, these are employees of media entities trying to make the sector work. When media owners sometimes are taking a step back, watching and depending on the work that must be done by their own employees. So it's a peculiar thing that's happening in our sector. So there is work that's being done, but it's usually targeted at what's emerging.
Thank you so much for the comprehensive answer. Maybe before I let you go briefly, I want to talk. The report also speaks about gendered threats. And we saw in the report that even at political rallies and also online abuse, it seems as if women were the main target, and some of the attacks had absolutely nothing to do with their work. It would involve maybe body shaming and maybe something sexually related, something like that, just to bring shame onto a female journalist and so forth. I know you are working on the continent with women. How big is a problem is it in South Africa and also on the continent?
It is a problem everywhere. And in fact, you can look at, there is a report that is coming. SANEF has done a study on how women journalists are exposed to cyberbullying and all sorts of bullying that happen, particularly with journalists. And we see a lot of this with journalists that cover politics, but now we're also seeing a lot with journalists that are covering migration issues, because that has become another hotspot for harassment of journalists who are reporting not in favor of what the different constituencies engaged in that space want to hear. So the kind of work that is being done is also, again, by groups that are interested in women's issues. And again, you hardly hear the voices of media owners, because gender inclusive reporting and gender issues where journalists feel unsafe being women are strategic issues. They are strategic issues from a media perspective. They are strategic in terms of editorial risks, and they are strategic in terms of moral considerations by media entities. But they are treated as something that women journalists must deal with themselves. It's like it comes with the terrain, and therefore you must toughen up. And I battle to understand why you would consider AI as something that requires strategic thinking and strategic directing within the company, but you don't see the same in terms of protecting an important segment of your staff, because it's a human resource strategy, but there are no protections for women journalists who find themselves having to deal with issues that are not just of health in terms of nature, it's also about the occupational risks that they get exposed to. But you hardly find any coordinated interventions within the entities themselves. They will either be referred to, for instance, we have SADC that has partnered with SANEF and other media NGOs within the sector in South Africa, where journalists get referred to SADC to call the line, the counseling lines and stuff. But what are media owners doing within the entities? Because these are your employees. They need debriefing platforms where they come from, even difficult stories outside just being harassed. These are things that we don't find in the spaces. So we need more commitment from media owners to treat gender issues, both from inclusive coverage and protection of women journalists being treated as strategy and not just moral, but strategic and editorial issues.
Thank you, Phathiswa, for raising that those key points. Yeah, and yeah, it's up to all of us, even the males in this room, and also in the media houses, to make sure that the working environment is conducive. And I hope other organizations and also bodies, journalists can take it up with the employers, have policies that make sure that there's equal treatment and protection for everyone. Maybe we can move on to another threat that seems to be it's not only a problem in South Africa, but it's a problem that we've seen in virtually throughout the region. The economic hardships and the carnage that they are causing. Perhaps we can start from an academic point of view. Dr. Ncube, I see you are back. I'm sorry we had lost you. I hope this time we'll be able to hear you clearly. How big a problem is it, not in this region, not only in South Africa, but maybe throughout the region, the economic hardships? We're seeing companies throughout the region laying off workers. Others are failing to pay. We have situations in some countries where journalists have gone for months without salaries and so forth. But as a researcher, Dr. Ncube, maybe you can shed light on how big this problem is before we look at how it can be tackled. Dr. Ncube, please, may you contribute? I think we're having a problem. I had seen that is online, but it seems he can't hear, or maybe when he's speaking we can't hear him. Maybe you'd want to take that one, Phathiswa.
Yeah, it's a widespread problem. And others attribute it to market failure, others attribute it to all sorts of things, including the digital disruption, which is also linked to what we call market failure now. But I do think that if we are going to find any solution to that, we are going to have to rethink the role of journalism, or reframe what journalism actually does. Because we've always taken the moral stance of journalism being a public good, and that journalism or democracies won't survive without journalism. But that's the high-level approach of what journalism does. If you were to do a journalism impact audit, what do you think you would find as the impact of journalism on society? And why aren't we elevating that as the hardcore contribution of journalism to stable societies and human development? Because if we are to attract any funding from anyone, we need to showcase what journalism contributes to society without dealing with the ideals as we know them. It is a big issue. Some talk about how digital platforms have disrupted the space to the extent that they extract, in fact, the whole value of what journalism gives to the platforms. But also, the same platforms are distribution channels for the same media entities. So if anyone is to look at governance for the digital platforms, we also need to look at ways to redistribute the value that these platforms generate from our news content. So it's one thing to talk about the Competition Commission inquiry and what it has said must be compensation and remedies to the media sector in South Africa. In fact, that's negligible if you look at the damage that the platforms have done. And if that is within a defined period, what happens beyond the defined period? How is the media going to survive beyond that? And also, we must also not underestimate the fact that some of these remedies are tied to sticking with these platforms that you don't think outside the platforms for you to survive. So it is important that we start thinking about the dependency that's being created in us getting the handouts, which actually mean nothing if you look at the quantities or the quantities that are being allocated. So sustainability is going to have to be redefined in terms of what journalism represents, and we need to think about journalism as civic and democratic infrastructure, which means that even state actors must think about contributing, because it's the political literacy that journalism drives. It's all the sorts of information literacies that journalism provides. It's election literacy that journalism provides to the different publics and audiences that it serves. So until we get to a point of showcasing the value of journalism and talk to policies that lead to the recognition of journalism as that critical infrastructure for societies and democracies, we are not going to go anywhere. Until we do that, we must talk to the issues that lead corporates to think differently about how they view journalism, that it's actually not a freebie and it's not discretionary spending when you sponsor an entity or you sponsor the covering of stories. Actually, you must make a commitment, because the same journalism deals with governance issues, good governance, transparency, and all the things that a good society needs. And therefore, you are able to operate your big business in this environment because journalism has made it possible for you to know what's going on, to know where your market is, to know what matters for you to pitch your products. So we need to think differently about sustainability, but it's a big issue. It doesn't matter where you go. Globally, the media is struggling.
Yeah, thank you so much, Phathiswa. Caroline, from an advocacy point of view, maybe with government and also with the big tech companies, what can be done? I know that there was the Competition Commission inquiry which said there must be compensation to South African media houses, and that there should be support for production and so forth. But what is happening around that area, and what can be salvaged? What can be salvaged and what cannot be salvaged? Bearing in mind also the relationship that should occur between maybe corporates and the media, because you don't want to be compromised at the same time, but you want some kind of support. How can that be worked out?
That's a difficult question, and I think it's a question that countries around the world are engaging with. And I think that following on from the Competition Commission report and the work that has sort of come around or come about between media houses since that, I think that that collaboration is really important, that it's important that we recognize that the media houses need to engage with each other and work together in a response to the sort of the disruptions that big tech and the digital news industry plays, but also to look to other examples around the world. Places like Australia and Ireland have been engaging with these issues similarly to us, and I think that it's, again, this is something that isn't unique to South Africa, but that we should try and not reinvent the wheel and look to see how other places have engaged with the issues.
Thank you, Caroline. Just to let everyone listening in that you can also ask questions. You can either raise your hand and we'll give you an opportunity to ask a question or even a suggestion. And at the same time, you're also free to write your question down. Then we can ask any of the panelists that are here. But
Yeah.
the economic hardships sorry.
Yeah. Just the point you were making about corporates and trying to make sure that you are not captured in relying on them. There's a layered problem that's sitting in that space. One, if you wanted to get corporates and everyone who has money to support journalism, we need to set up journalism sustainability funds, and SANEF is working on one, and there is already one fund that exists, even though it's not for an extended period. It's money that's coming from Google. It's the Digital News Transformation Fund, which is targeted at community media. So we need more of those funds. And what actually helps, once you have that fund, you let it administered independently of the entities that contribute, such that they have no influence on what happens to the monies, or that they are even known to have contributed to the money. So there is a de-risking mechanism that's required if you are to pull those funds from different sources. But we do need to set up journalism sustainability funds. So we don't have a luxury of saying this money is going to work and this is not going to work. Already, we know with donor funding, it comes with its own problems, but we always find ways to mitigate the risk of interference where donor funding is concerned. Yeah.
Thank you, Phathiswa. It seems like South Africa is moving in the right direction there, and is certainly ahead of many countries in the region with the Journalism Sustainability Fund. How is it structured to work? I know it's not yet operational, but is it something that will be run through SANEF, or is it? Are you going to have like a secretariat around it?
Similarly to the process with the competition inquiry, it was initiated by the Editors Forum. And this fund is also being initiated by the Editors Forum, but we are setting up an independent agency that's going to run it, such that we ourselves are not involved in the processes of allocation of funds or determining who gets the money or who doesn't. So it's going to be run independently, but we're still setting up the governance structures for that process.
Brilliant. Thank you so much for that. While we're looking at these economic hardships, Magnificent spoke about the carnage in the industry, job losses, Media 24, Mail and Garden, and a whole lot, Daily Maverick, media institutions have had to lay off staff because they are basically struggling. They can't attract enough advertising. In fact, the whole revenue model has been disrupted by big tech, technology, and so forth. But what is this doing to journalism, the quality of journalism in South Africa? Has it been affected? Because some of the people that are leaving the industry are the old hands, the experienced hands, leaving newsrooms in the hands of younger people, some of them not so experienced and so forth. But how has this affected quality journalism, including investigative journalism?
If you look at just investigative journalism, it's intense in terms of the money that it requires and the time it takes to produce. So you're seeing less and less of that being produced, particularly by the broadcast sector. Print media, digital, is still doing the best it can within the resource capacity that it has. So you're starting to see a decline where that is concerned. Similarly, with the rest of the coverage of stories, you're starting to see a trend. Not that it's something new, but it's intense now. There's a move towards convenient reporting. I could be sitting here. I know that Parliament is going to be running something live, or a company or a political party is going to be making a statement. All I do is to log online and I listen. I don't have to move. But where and how am I going to ask questions when I'm not on site, where the stories are being are actively taking place, where you have people on the scene or on site having conversations, when you are sitting at home watching me talk here? So how are you going to be asking questions in a setting where it's a gathering. It's different when we are online like this because people can still engage. But when it's a live environment, how do you get as a journalist to ask questions while you are sitting in the office because you don't have the capacity to get on site? But also what we're starting to see as well, it's the I call it brown rice and lentils coverage, where rural and far-flung areas get less attention because all the coverage that is convenient and less costly is sitting in urban setup. It's easy urban setups because it's easy to access those stories. So we're starting to see news deserts in areas that actually require amplification in terms of the plight of those communities. It is a huge, so it's not just a quality issue, it's also a quantity issue in terms of the number of stories that get produced and who gets covered and who doesn't get covered. And one could easily say the issues of sustainability are starting to hinder the flow of information, which is critical for public for the public's right to know. If you're not going to cover certain areas, it means that there are things that are not included. It's something that has made me have to answer several questions about the statements I have made about why it's important to fund public broadcasting. What we are seeing, particularly where broadcasters in the country are concerned, private entities, you have a public broadcaster that relies on commercial advertising, and it's competing with private entities that should actually be competing within the small pie that's available as advertising. But you also have now a public entity, a massive public entity that competes with small private entities in terms of size, that should not be crowded out in terms of funding or fighting for advertising, as with the case of the public broadcaster. So while we may think that it's just digital disruption and other issues that have happened, there is an issue around the fact that the public broadcaster, because of its size, it's crowding out private entities that should actually be fighting for advertising revenues and not compete with the public broadcaster. So there are things that need to be considered there, and these are policy issues that need to be looked at.
Thank you, Phathiswa, for that. And I'm wondering, because of these economic hardships elsewhere in the region, we found that there's a problem, a rising problem in certain parts of the world. They call it brown envelope journalism. And we're wondering, because of this situation in South Africa, is there such a problem? And also, in some jurisdictions, there is media capture when because media, maybe a big companies know that you're struggling, you need advertising. If they advertise, you want to write a story about them, they pull out their adverts, and when they do that, you are left vulnerable and so forth. So we now have, in certain countries, they're untouchable companies, untouchable individuals and so forth. Are we seeing this in South Africa, or are we going to move into that?
What we are seeing, maybe the shades of the envelopes in terms of being brown, they are brown, and other brown. There are countries on the continent where journalists have no salaries. We think that we get paid low salaries. If you look at what we get, there are countries on the continent that have no salaries for journalists. So if you go and cover a media briefing or you go and cover a story, you depend on whoever wants the story published, that is the actors, to pay you to actually go and report on that story. So that's how they get paid. So that's why I'm saying we talk about brown envelopes as a product of being unethical in our context. But in those cases, that's how you get paid as a journalist. You don't have a salary. You don't get a salary from the company that you work for. You get a salary or whatever you're going to be paid based on what you were able to collect when you went to cover the story, because you're going to publish the story and then you bring the revenue. So that's how it works. That's why I'm saying it's different shades of brown envelopes. Some are institutionalized in the case of countries where there are no salaries for journalists, but in other cases which would apply in South Africa, because here we have salaries for journalists. They may not be the best levels of payment for journalists, but yeah, it's unethical conduct in our case.
Thank you. We've got a comment from Dale McKinley to the group, basically saying there's a significant difference between funding from donors who proactively seek to support journalism without conditionalities related to content and direct funds from corporate corporate capital, whose funds availability are most often dependent on not crossing specific economic and political ideological content. Lines whose reason deter is to varyingly make profits and banish their PR profiles. Yeah, I think
that is true. It's not all bad. It's not like wholly bad. You have donor funding that is credible, that actually advances the cause of journalism. So I agree with Jane there.
I'd wanted to say something on it. It's just that I hoped I could raise my hand, but it looks like I need to parachute myself. But I'd wanted to expand on the point, and I'm unseen because it says you cannot start your video because it's been disabled by the host, in case you wonder why I'm a ghost now. But Phathiswa had mentioned, and this I want to tie it back to this, the economic threats and all of that, and the finances just to sustain the media. If you look, Phathiswa mentioned about news desert zones and all of that, where actual areas truly really need the media to shine light on all of that. Because sometimes in this country, and it seems to be an African problem also as well, that sometimes things get to be done until a certain media houses shine light on an issue, and then other colleagues then exactly. And then you look in the case, for example, like community medias. If you were to try to imagine maybe environmental stories happening somewhere in Venda, it is just so far from Joburg. That's like about almost 600 kilometers from Joburg. So chances are the big media institutions may be reluctant to pay so much just to get to Venda unless you really have the economic muscles. But also, generally in government, if you look at government spending, there's this 30% rule that whatever money that you have as a government entity, because each entity is responsible for their own advertising spend. So part of the report is why we couldn't properly track who spends what to where, because each department, each entity decides however they want to use their budget. But there's this 30% spend. You then find it is quite more rife in community medias, because this is where, if you think about a district municipality or local municipality, this is where mayors now get to call the shots, because the survival for community media outlets is even much more dire, that they can't almost survive without this kind of funding. And oftentimes, most of their funding comes from this threshold of the small piece that comes from this 30%. And then you find that if you were to do a critical piece on a certain mayor in a district, therefore that paper itself risk not getting advertising. It goes the same again with even companies. Having been an editor for community papers, where we see that, so if you look at your stakeholders around, you have company A and B and C and D. It's almost like you also can't afford just to report bad about them simply because they are also the very same entities that will have to be placing advertisement in your newspaper. Otherwise, you're screwed. I think that's the point that I'd also wanted to touch on.
Thank you. Thank you, Max. And I think PS has shared. If you can go into the chat, yes, shared a report on legal threats in Kenya. And the same organization that produced that report is doing one for South Africa, and it's due to release a report in June. So it's something that we can look at and see what's happening around there. Yeah, but maybe moving forward, we've seen that these economic hardships are a real big threat, and not only in South Africa. I think throughout the region, the report that we've received, it was this. It has been a common thread that this is maybe the way forward as we round up. There are a whole lot of threats, but what needs to be done? And before we go into this, I need to mention that Interwatch is not only just producing these kind of reports. Interwatch is willing to partner other organizations like SANEF to do advocacy around these issues, to approach the right people, to make sure a report like this one lands on the desks of influential people, whether it's in government, whether it's in parliament, and so forth. So in the same vein, we believe that there should be advocacy around these issues, and it mustn't just be a talk show. There are some colleagues in this room who are part of this meeting who know that Interwatch trained journalists on cybersecurity issues, personal security, and so forth, and in South Africa. And then there was a follow-up trainings in each of the 7 countries where these reports were written. So similarly, would want to carry on with this work. And now we want to move into the section where we deal with what needs to be done. And maybe we'll start with Naledi, with the key recommendations, what you think can be done. Then we'll ask Caroline and also Phathiswa to share what they believe are the major problems facing the South African media and what needs to be done. So maybe, Naledi, if you can just share your key recommendations.
Okay, thank you so much, Owen. Because obviously, I'm sure people can access the reports. I will go through, some of the key points, and then everyone else can chime in from their side of this conversation. So basically, for policymakers and governments, some of our key recommendations would be to review and repeal laws that criminalize journalism. And as Magnificent had mentioned earlier, these laws were definitely not intended to criminalize journalism, but because the clauses in the laws are so vague, they leave too much room for the laws to be abused, as we've heard about throughout this webinar. The other point would be to ensure transparency in surveillance legislation, to enact whistleblower protection laws. I think this is such a key point because some of the most important stories that a nation would need to hear come through whistleblowers. So there is a legal framework in South Africa for whistleblowers. However, the general concern pertains to the level of protection that whistleblowers experience in practice. There was a study, I'll find it and maybe put a link to it in the chat, that was speaking about the fact that whistleblowers find themselves worse off after being whistleblowers. They find themselves very depressed. They find themselves, out in the cold of whatever industry they're in. If you were working in social services and now you're trying to find another job and you happen to whistleblow in the department, like in a department, you find yourself, out in the cold. So we definitely need to work on that. And some of the other points would be to strengthen legal aid networks for journalists, as everyone here has said, because the newsrooms just simply do not have money we are basically compromising, and a lot of newsrooms obviously won't come outright and say we actually stop pursuing the story because of the legal repression, but it happens quite a lot. You know, I've been in a situation where I was writing about a corporation. The first article came out, and then they kind of lock us into just a small back and forth between the lawyers. So because of that, then your follow up, you know, is held back. And before you know it, it's been 3 months. Before you know it, it's been 4 months. And by then the story has gone cold. So those are even some of the smaller ways in which things like this affect like the integrity of our journalism and how deep we can go with stories. Develop rapid response mechanisms, and to create a coordinated legal defense fund, an emergency hotline for journalists facing harassment, detention, censorship. Some of the other points would be to work towards financial media viability, to form cross-sector coalitions, to prioritize journalist wellness, which is also such a key point. You know, a lot of people find themselves leaving journalism and migrating to like adjacent industries, and one of the two major reasons would be money and mental health. So those are like two key issues when it comes to the journalists themselves, over and above what the industry is dealing with when we're speaking about the law and when we're speaking about the other forms of repression that they might be dealing with. So yeah, I'll stop it there, but I'd just like to say, before like I end what I'm saying now, is I think Phathiswa mentioned this, like because of how hard it actually is to be a journalist and these issues we deal with on a daily basis, I think we don't actually even record as much as we should. South Africa is we're really good with documenting, but what we found is not even like, I don't know, journalists never want to make themselves the story. So because of that, I think we're really not documenting as much as we possibly could what journalists are faced with on a daily, because then you don't want to make it a big deal and you just want to move on to your next story, whereas you could have been almost gotten stoned while you're on the field, things like that. Got insulted because you're a woman on the field. Have maybe your media house is dealing with a minor legal issue where it's not a slap suit and it's not a big gag order, but there is something brewing at the back that we can't even mention. So I'd like to say, you know, for everyone in the room, that we must continue documenting and we must continue like sounding the alarm on what we're dealing with, and nothing is too big or small. So I think that would be a recommendation that we didn't put in there, for us to find ways for us to document what journalists face on a daily basis.
Thank you so much, Naledi, for your input. I want to ask Caroline to share her opinion, and to Caroline, I want to ask, in your view, what are the severe leak or the severe threats that you think South African media is facing, and what do we need to do? What needs to be done? What are the priority areas that need to be addressed?
Thanks, Owen. I think what I will do is also just highlight some of the aspects that Naledi mentioned, because I think it's something that is crucial. And Phathiswa touched on it a little bit earlier as well, the formation of the Free Expression Legal Network. And this is a very important development, I think, in South African journalism. And the idea behind it is that when journalists are facing legal threats, often they are either freelancers or they're from small, unresourced newsrooms, and they aren't able to get legal assistance. And this network, the idea behind it is that they are then journalists who are facing legal threats, whether it's a slap suit, charges, and being faced with a harassment charge, which we've seen being used as well, or physical safety that they feel they need some legal advice on. They are then able to contact these lawyers who are part of the network, who can then offer their services. And I think that is really important, because from Amabhungane's perspective, we've always been lucky that because we have an advocacy arm to our media house. We are able to respond to legal threats because we have some resources dedicated to it, but we also have the relationships with lawyers that can either offer their services pro bono, and not all journalists are in that position. So I think we need to encourage lawyers to provide some services to this network and other similar examples like that. I think another aspect is, I think it's really important for the media to engage proactively with bills. So as I mentioned, we often make submissions to Parliament on bills that are moving through that might have an impact on the media or the freedom of expression experience more generally. And I think very few media houses do that. And what that means then is that it's often only corporates or other sectors in society who feel that they might be affected by these potential laws, who then make submissions to Parliament. And so the information that Parliament is getting is often skewed against the media. And so I would really encourage journalists and media houses to engage with that. For example, the Protected Disclosures Bill has been published by the Department of Justice, and that introduces a new sphere to whistleblower protection in South Africa. And obviously journalists deal with whistleblowers very, very frequently. But from what I've seen is that there haven't been many journalists or media houses who are planning to engage with the bill and make submissions to Parliament. So that's one aspect that I would recommend that is done more proactively. And then just the last thing, which sort of ties into both, but it's being aware of unintended consequences of objectively or ostensibly good and important pieces of legislation. And we've seen this with the abuse of the harassment laws against journalists. It's vitally important that we do have anti-harassment laws. A lot of them have been adopted to prevent and to protect women who are facing violence from potentially intimate partners or other men in their circles. And so obviously that's an objectively good piece of legislation, but it's capable of abuse, and subjects of journalistic inquiry are now using it to prevent journalists from sending them questions or asking them, giving them an opportunity for a right to reply. And so we also need to be a little bit more proactive in recognizing when those unintended consequences of good laws are being abused, and then trying to take action against that. So pushing for education around in police stations and with judicial officials to understand what the harassment laws actually mean and how they shouldn't be utilized by people facing questions from journalists. And then if this type of legislation comes up for amendment in Parliament, to engage with that again. So I think that's where I will stop from the sort of what needs to be done from a legal threat perspective.
Thank you, Caroline. Phathiswa, there was a question which came directly into my inbox, which I didn't ask. There's a journalist asking if there are any media houses that are specifically asking journalists to sign surveillance enabling contracts. And if so, how many are they? And when you answer that, may you also go into what you think the major threats facing the South African media are, and what needs to be done? What areas should we focus on advocacy and so forth?
I'm being asked a tough question. Starting with the first one on surveillance, I can't say it's 10 or 20. It depends on the media houses themselves and how the contracts are crafted. I know because I was in one newsroom that had that, and to the extent that I had to raise it with the executive and actually tell the executive that because there was an opportunity to reissue contracts because of a process to reconfigure the organization. And it was the moment that I used to actually say to the executive, can we think about how we remove this from the contracts? But it was a case of no, but it's always been here and it's about protecting the organization. I actually had to tell the entire newsroom not to sign the contracts, the new contracts that were issued, until that clause was removed. And it was removed. But the thing is, it is embedded in our employment contracts, and we don't think about it when we sign. In fact, we don't even look at it. So it could be that even the journalist that's asking signed that kind of contract, but it's important to always check your contract and see what you are saying yes to. It's always presented as protecting the technical environment of the company, but you are actually consenting to being intercepted in your communication. There were times when I would be sitting and looking at my screen, answering my phone, and I would see my cursor moving and someone was reading my emails, and that's how it works. So we need to be paying attention to such. And the one thing that I wanted to speak to as well, in terms of monitoring the different pieces of legislation that are being crafted that could have implications for the media. I do think that a multi-stakeholder approach would work, understanding the capacity of newsrooms as we know them now, that they can't even afford to do the basics. Imagine if you have to deploy someone to go and pay attention to a bill, which is actually critical, but it's just that we don't have the capacity in the newsrooms to actually do that, which is why a multi-stakeholder approach is important. We must be able to depend on the media lawyers who can do the work pro bono, and media rights NGOs who can support the protection of the freedoms of the media sector. But fundamentally, my thing is, until you address sustainability issues, media integrity is always going to remain a problem. And media integrity is also tied to sustainability of media organizations, because if you're not trusted, there are always issues there. So while the drive is towards information integrity, which is a big thing now, information integrity comes with media integrity. So if you don't address the bigger problem, which is the moral architecture of media houses, you are always going to be talking about information integrity where media houses are concerned. That needs to be addressed. So the importance of media sustainability is critical, because it does not help to just work on the laws that prohibit or inhibit the media from doing its work if you have no media houses to apply those laws on in the first place. So the issue of sustainability is critical, but it's as important as other peripheral or issues that are within the periphery of the media houses or the environment of the media houses. So we need to address both at the same time, understanding that they are interdependent for the media to actually carry its work. Because again, you don't want to have sustainable media that is not able to do its work because of constraints that are imposed by authorities or political actors. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Phathiswa. It's very unfortunate that we can't hear from Dr. Ncube. I think he's having challenges with the communication device, but it would have been interesting to also hear the views from the academic side. But nonetheless, I just want to thank everyone for attending, and I also want to thank Phathiswa and Caroline for your for sharing your thoughts with us and taking time to be on this panel. It was I found your contributions quite valid, and I also learned a lot about the legal landscape in South Africa and what needs to be done. Thank you so much, and thank you so much, colleagues, for joining this webinar. Next week we'll be discussing Zimbabwe. It's quite a different environment from the South African one, but yeah, there are some similarities here and there. Thank you so much, and goodbye to everyone.
Thank you, Owen. Thanks,
Thank
everyone.
you, and goodbye.
Bye.
Thank you.
Thank you, Owen. Thank you so much, everyone.
Thanks, Naledi.
Thank you.
Thank you, Naledi. Thank you, Magnificent. Thank you, Phathiswa. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you. Bye.